We're going to be in chapter 14, and we're addressing some particulars about spiritual gifts. Specifically, we're looking at what are known as the sign gifts, the gifts that were used as a sign for other people. There are actually 4 sign gifts. You have speaking in tongues, you have prophecy, you have miracles, you have healings. But we're only going to focus on the first 2, which is what Paul addresses in the 14th chapter. Now, there is some debate over whether or not these particular gifts are still active. So scholars like to hash this stuff out. A lot of questions from some perspectives. These gifts have ceased. They're no longer used. And those who have that viewpoint really use a passage close to chapter 14 to determine their viewpoint on this, that these particular gifts aren't used anymore. You see, in chapter 12, Paul starts the subject of spiritual gifts. He wraps that discussion up in chapter 14, but squeezed in between is chapter 13, which we often refer to as the love chapter. But if you look down in verse 8 of chapter 13 very quickly, verses 8, 9, and 10, you'll see that Paul makes this statement. He says, "Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away." And so what this tells us that at some point, these sign gifts like prophecy and speaking in tongues, they're going to cease. And that's going to happen when the perfect comes. But the question is, what is the perfect? And has it occurred? Has it shown up yet? Some say that the perfect, what Paul refers to it here in this chapter 13, that it refers to the completion of the Bible, that the Bible itself is the perfect. And that after the Bible was complete, because when Paul writes the book of 1 Corinthians, other books are going to be written. The canon as we have it, Genesis to Revelation, had not been officially determined. We didn't have the complete Bible, if you will, up to that point. And so when Paul is writing this, there's some who say, no. When the final book is written and the Bible is complete, the Bible is perfect, that's when we're not going to need such things as prophecy and speaking in tongues. And so that means that those gifts are no longer necessary. And since we got the Bible a long time ago, these gifts stopped a long time ago. And if that's your viewpoint, they have a name for it. It's called cessationism. You're a cessationist. That means you believe that the certain gifts have ceased. Others say, no, the perfect is not the Bible. Who is perfect? Well, Jesus is perfect. And so these gifts are going to still be active until Jesus comes back one day. And so these gifts are still available. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat, we don't have time to unpack all of this. My viewpoint is I'm not a cessationist. I do believe that this is more than likely pointing to Jesus rather than the Bible. And it's not my position that there's enough evidence scripturally to say that these gifts have ceased. I wish I could unpack it more for you. You don't have time to do that. However, let me make this statement. I do believe that these gifts, even the gift of tongues, especially the gift of tongues, though it may still be active, and I don't speak in tongues, but though it may still be an active gift, that gift is now extremely limited. Its use is extremely limited by what we read in Scripture, specifically what we see in chapter 14. Therefore, I believe it's quite unusual, especially today, for it to be seen if it's still available. You'll see why as we unpack this chapter. Now, because of the nature of this text, the approach I'm going to take with this message is going to be more like a teaching approach rather than a preaching approach. It's going to feel more like a Bible study than a sermon, so just keep that in mind. Nevertheless, it should challenge you to be biblical in your worship, and that's what we want, certainly. So let's go to verse 1, because there Paul begins to make a comparison between speaking in tongues and the gift of prophecy. And he pretty much gives the nod to prophecy as being more important, more desirable than speaking in tongues. Look at verse 1. He says, "Pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy." So Paul's saying, look, it's okay for you to desire all of the gifts, but if you're really going to desire one over another, desire prophesying. Not that the Corinthian believers would have agreed with him on this point. Remember, this group of believers struggled over these sign gifts. As we saw last week in chapter 12, there were Christians in this church that like to use the more exotic gifts, like speaking in tongues, as a sign to show that they were a spiritual person. And if one person had the gift of tongues,